Today's guest is Dr. Dale Maglalang, an assistant professor at New York University's Silver School of Social Work and one of the nation's leading scholars examining how racism, oppression, and systems of inequality impact the health and well-being of communities of color. With 6 degrees spanning Asian American studies, public health, epidemiology, and social work, Dr. Maglalang brings a uniquely interdisciplinary perspective to his work. His research explores the social and structural forces that shape our lives, from the model minority myth to racial triangulation, immigrant identity, and critical consciousness, and how we can heal from the harmful effects of these systems. He is also the founder of the Asian American Critical Consciousness Project, a public resource dedicated to helping people better understand Asian American history, identity, and collective liberation. In today's conversation, Dr. Maglalang helps us unpack the hidden history behind the model minority myth and offers a powerful roadmap back to authenticity, community, and hope. Let's take a listen. Okay, well, Dr. Dale Maglalang, we are so thrilled to have you today, and I'm so excited to jump into this conversation.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Him.
Absolutely. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the model minority myth, racism, systems of oppression, and I know I came to you, I found you by way of the Asian American Consciousness Project, and you are the founder and the principal investigator of this project. I should also mention to Courage class that I was counting the number of degrees at the end of your name on the NYU website. And I counted, and let me know if I'm off here, that you have 6 degrees total across your undergrad all the way up to your graduate work. Am I right in counting
Yeah, I
that?
think so. I wasn't counting.
You've lost count. There's so many.
But no, thank you for highlighting it. Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible. So you have 6 degrees, if I may just share with the Courage class community, across Asian American studies, public health, epidemiology, and social work. And obviously, you are currently a faculty member at NYU. I mean, it's just incredible, just the knowledge base that you draw upon to put the work out that you, and we're going to jump into, of course, your work. We could start our conversation out with just an overview of your body of work and expertise. Would you be willing to share that with us?
Yes. So my name is Dr. Dale Maglalang. I use he and they pronouns. I'm currently an assistant professor at New York University Silver School of Social Work. So I come from a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary background, as Dr. Chu highlighted. So my research primarily looks into how does racism and other forms of oppression influence substance use
Mm.
among BIPOC and sexual and gender minority populations, and also how do we intervene on the negative effects of these two relationships.
Mm. And that intervention, it sounds like, is incredibly important work to support the community at large. And I'm curious to know, before we really dig into the research, can we just sort of explore your childhood? I would love to know how you even came to this work. And I'm wondering from you, Professor, when did you first notice that being Asian American came with a set of assumptions or predetermined labels attached?
Yes, and I think it was more of a gradual
Mm,
event for me because I was born and raised in the Philippines, and I didn't move to the US until I was 11 years old. So I actually moved to Los Angeles and Echo Park, which is designated by the city as historic Filipino town, or we
yes,
call it Hi-Fi.
yes.
So that neighborhood is predominantly, at least when I was growing up, a Latinx and Filipino immigrant working class community. I mean,
Mm,
over time, it has completely changed.
yeah,
Now, when I go and visit home, it looks completely different from what I grew up on.
I imagine.
But I think for me, being Asian American, I didn't know I was Asian American. I think it became a little bit more, um, I think, prominent until when I started high school. Because for the longest time, I was just identifying as Filipino. And I think when I went to high school, I went to a very racially diverse high school, but I was part of the two honors program in my school.
Mm,
And there we had a very um, large population of Asian Americans within the honors program. So I think that's when I started kind of noticing this racial lumping of Asian Americans and then having this sense of expectations to perform well. And I think, I don't know if that's more of a combination of being in an honors program and being Asian American. And at the same time, I think being immigrant, I
Hmm.
think there's this also sense of pressure to succeed, right? Because I think especially in Asian cultures where it's
Yes.
it's this sense of gratitude and debt to our family for all their sacrifices in order for them to bring us here. So I
Yeah.
think it was a combination of all of that. And I didn't know what it was called until I went to college and I took my first Asian American studies class and learned about the model minority myth. And that's when it clicked for me. I was like, oh, there's a label to what I was experiencing.
Wow.
So it was kind of that moment when I finally was able to put a name to that experience.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. You just mentioned the model minority myth, and how that sort of put language to the experiences that you had had up until that point. Would you be willing, for those of us who may not be as familiar with this construct, how would you define it? Who created it? And what purpose does this label serve?
Yes. So the model minority myth is primarily this stereotype that Asian Americans are academically and economically successful,
Mm,
right? So, and I think I would also include my own definition that I think in order to understand the model minority myth, it also has to be understood within the lens of white supremacy, of capitalism,
yeah.
and patriarchy, right? Because I think there's also this expectation for not only for us to be academically and economically successful, but we also have to be heterosexual, right?
Mhm.
We also have to be cisgender and we also have to be able-bodied in
Yeah.
order to produce labor for these institutions and companies that we work for. And as we know with Asian Americans, we kind of hit this bamboo ceiling, right? We know that oftentimes Asian Americans are less likely to be in these decision making spaces or like what they call like C suites, right? We're often placed in entry level or middle management roles. So I think as a whole, like that's the definition of the model minority myth. In terms of its history, I think when people think of the model minority myth, I think a lot of people attribute it to that infamous Time magazine cover that was
Yes.
published in 1987, right? It was a picture of these young Asian Americans posing. I think there were 5 kids there, and the title was like "These Asian American Whiz Kids," right? But I think a lot of people don't know that this racial project of the model minority myth has been in the works for decades before that, right? So there was this wonderful book that was published in 2013 by Ellen D. Wu, and it's called The Color of Success. And it's
Mm,
this history of how the model minority myth came to be. And she really talks about primarily Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans
mm,
as the main example of how the model minority myth um, was developed. And I think just to kind of like look back on that with Japanese Americans, it really kind of started around the 1940s because, as we know, then Japanese Americans were unjustly incarcerated in internment camps during World
mhm,
War II.
mhm.
So there was a study already that was being done during internment by a UC Berkeley sociologist professor. And the study is called JERS. It's the Japanese American Evacuation and Resettlement Study. And they were primarily looking into primarily Japanese American Nisei generations, which is the second generation. These are US born and educated Japanese Americans. And there they found that they were more likely to shed themselves of their Japanese heritage and culture and were more likely to embrace this white middle class image, right?
Right.
And at the same time, post internment, right, the last internment camp closed in 1946. Uh, a group of sociologists, also at the University of Chicago, were doing a study among Japanese Americans in the Midwest, and they also found that Japanese Americans were more likely to be business owners and they were more likely to be successful at work because they were diligent, they worked hard, they didn't rock the boat, they were apolitical, right?
Mm, mhm.
So again, kind of maintaining this good image, right?
Yes.
Because of this trauma of being um, in, incarcerated,
Yeah.
really, right? Is
Yeah.
what happened.
Yeah.
So that happened among Japanese Americans, and then among Chinese Americans. Uh, Ellen Wu talks about this rise of Chinese American youth delinquency in Chinatowns across the country, right? And it's
Interesting.
around the 1940s to the 1950s, and it gained a lot of media attention by the 1950s.
Hmm.
So, particularly in the Bay Area, in San Francisco and San Mateo. I think a lot of Chinese American organizations were really concerned about this negative media attention that Chinatowns were getting,
Oh, I see.
right? So they wanted to address this delinquency. And
Mm.
when we think about it, right, 1943 was when the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed.
Yeah.
So again, there's already this idea of being playing a good minority, right?
Yeah.
Because they've been lawfully excluded for so
Yeah.
long since 1882. And at the same time, the 1950s was the Cold War. And we know China got involved with the Korean War as well. So again, seeing what happened to Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans were also wanting to play this good minority,
This is
right?
so, yeah. Sorry. Oh, go
Yeah, go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just going to say this is so fascinating to me because here I came into this conversation really believing that it's a stereotype that's constructed sort of by the external forces, but it also
Mhm.
sounds as though as it's also a narrative that we as at least from a Chinese American perspective and a Japanese American perspective based on these two studies that we really were played a role in shaping that narrative as well. It almost sounds as though it's part of our means to survive, the
Yes.
context. As I think about the construct, gosh, I've been giving myself personally such a hard time, don't think of yourself a model minority model, but at the same time, I have this like knee-jerk reaction to also offer the community generally at large, like a lot of compassion because I'm learning from you right now in real time. We had to do that to survive. There was a need to demonstrate our loyalty to the US.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we have to kind of look at it as with a lot of compassion, as you pointed out. And
Yeah.
really, it was a means of survival,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think it was a response to this really decades of being excluded, right?
Decades of being excluded. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of Chinese organizations around the 1950s really organized to create youth spaces and youth organizations to quell the rising
Wow.
delinquency. And it wasn't until 1966 when kind of these two seminal articles came out in mainstream media. So
Yes.
one was written by William Peterson that was published in the New York Times Magazine. In 1966, it was the success story Japanese American style that was talking about Japanese Americans. And then there was another article that came out in US News and World Report called Success Story of One Minority Group in the US that talked about Chinese Americans in Chinatown. And this is when we really saw kind of the wording of the
Oh,
model minority really emerge in mainstream discussion. Um,
wow.
yeah, because they were comparing Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans to other people of color, particularly among Black and African Americans. So,
Mhm.
like, let's say the US News and World Report article, they talk about, the overcrowding in Chinatowns, that despite the overcrowding, you see little violence and that Chinese American youth were succeeding academically, but you can't say the same for Harlem. In New York,
Mm.
which is predominantly a Black
Wow.
African American community. And
Wow.
then similarly, in the Peterson article, he also compares, look at Japanese Americans who have succeeded, who was able to replicate what the Irish, Italians, and Polish people were able to do when they came to the US. But you can't say the same for Black African Americans. And they actually say this Mexicans, Indians, and Filipinos. So that's
Wow.
kind of
Yeah.
when the model minority really entered the conversation within the mainstream society conversation.
So there was no ownership, it sounds like, or acknowledgement of the history of our country inside of these conversations. It was just a sort of usurping, a taking away of somebody's narrative and pitting groups
Yes.
against other people in absence of acknowledging the history of our country, which sounds, and pardon my language, it's just, I don't know, that sounds so I won't say it.
It
Effed
sounds, yeah,
up. I effed up. Well, I mean, right now, I wanted to ask you about racial triangulation, another another construct that appears in your work. Could you talk about, and you're starting to talk about it, but if we could just give it its own airtime, if that would be okay with you, what exactly is racial triangulation? Where does that come from? Yeah.
Yeah, racial triangulation theory was conceptualized by Claire Jean Kim, right,
Okay.
in the late 1990s, I believe. Yeah,
Okay.
late 1990s, and it's a seminal paper. But it's a theory that really kind of looks at how Asian Americans are wedged or triangulated, right, between white people and also
Mhm.
Black and African Americans. I think a lot of folks, not just Asian Americans,
Yeah.
so, yes, I think in general, racial triangulation theory has been really used to really create this wedge
Uh,
among Asian Americans and other people of color, right?
yeah.
Not just Black African Americans, but we've seen it as well with Latinx Americans, as well as Native Americans.
That's that's incredible. It's really disappointing actually to hear you share this because it doesn't sound like Asian Americans were involved at all in sort of okaying, this narrative, this model minority narrative, and now it's being used as a tool to pit us against other groups. Am I right in saying
I
that?
think to an extent, right? I think as you said earlier, it was a form of survival for a lot of Asian Americans to like kind of also feed into this. So I think
Uh,
to an extent, I think we have also played an active role in its creation
okay.
because we allowed it to basically, as a form of survival, we allowed to play into this expectation of what a good person of color should look like
I
and
see.
behave like,
Yeah.
right? And we've seen this more recently as well, right? With the eradication of affirmative action in
Mm,
2023 with race based college admissions, where we've seen some Asian American organizations fully support this,
yeah.
knowing the fact that it will
Yeah.
also not only affect people in our community,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also other people of color, right? Because I think
Absolutely.
oftentimes we're racially lumped together, but a lot of people actually don't know that when you disaggregate data among Asian Americans, particularly among Southeast Asian populations,
Yeah.
they have the lowest rate of educational attainment of any
Yeah.
ethnic and people of color group in the country.
Yeah.
So it masks these disparities as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious to know from you, how do we actively reject it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things we can really think about is, when you asked me that, I think a lot of this wonderful book that Bianca Mabute published about a year or two ago, Unassimilable. And it's really, she kind of argues that as Asian Americans, why do we continue to push ourselves to assimilate?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why don't we just like not even force ourselves to assimilate into the model minority, right? And really reject kind of this idea of that we only move within our community. So really look into what this cross-racial solidarity and organizing
Mm,
might mean. And I think a lot of people feel like just because an issue doesn't affect us doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us at all. Because I mean, all these
yeah.
systems of oppression are all tied together,
They're all linked.
right?
Yes.
They're all linked, right? It's a
Yep.
whole system that is
Yep.
designed on purpose,
Yes.
right? So I think really being able to understand, like when we think about the recent rise of deportations, right? A lot
Mm,
of people think, oh, that's a Latin issue. But
yeah.
really, like when we look at Asian Americans, also have a large population of undocumented immigrants that are also being and have been deported, right?
Yeah.
So really understanding that actually we're all in this together in
Mm,
terms of really doing cross-racial solidarity. It's also about education,
yeah.
right? That I think one, learning more about our own history of survival and resistance as Asian American communities, but also understanding that we didn't do all of this alone, that this was a lot of cross racial organizing together,
Mm,
right? That we're able to have these rights that we have today, right?
yeah.
So I think being able to like have that understanding and having that critical consciousness
Yeah.
is really important.
Yes, absolutely. I would have to agree with you. I imagine, even speaking from my own experience, when you do absorb this, and you do try your best to play out the model minority, the myth, the mythology of the model minority. Could you share with us, what does it cost a person individually, both mentally and physically, to spend a lifetime trying to live up to this? Um, when we know that the narrative was never ours to begin with.
One of the things that we've seen over time is
Yeah.
really particularly what it does to our mental health. So there was a paper that was published by Anthony Bowie and his colleagues in JAMA Pediatrics about, I think, a year or two ago. And I ended up, because of that article, I ended up writing this op-ed for Newsweek, and I titled it "The Model Minority is Killing Asian American Youth." And really what they found is that among Asian Americans, 15 to 24-year olds, it is now the leading cause of suicidality is now the leading cause of death in this age group.
Yeah.
And they particularly saw higher rates of suicide among Korean and Southeast Asian populations
Mm.
because of this constant pressure. I mean, that age group are youth who are applying to colleges,
Yeah.
right? So I think, and also in college, in higher education. So there's this really constant pressure to adhere to the model minority expectation and really do well, that it's causing poor mental health among our young Asian Americans. And I think what it also does to us beyond that is that I think we're not able to kind of see ourselves beyond these like one-dimensional characters of
Mm.
what the Western media already shows us
Yeah.
to be,
Yeah.
right? So I think it also robs us of being someone else that's beyond what we already see and what we've seen in the media. And I think it really doesn't allow us to have that more multidimensional expectation of who we can be, right? And
Yeah.
what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said multi-dimensional, and I'm curious to know from you, because you work directly with college students, graduate students, just even as, if I may include you in like the older population, the aunties and the uncles, of the community, what role can we play in supporting our youth, particularly ages 15 to 24, in embracing the multidimensionality of who they are? Uh,
Like one specifically, I truly believe that ethnic studies saves lives. It saved my life
wow.
because I was really able to learn about history of resistance and organizing and really critical theories and framework within that was really created by people of color. And I
Mm,
think that really gave me an understanding of who I could be, right? I think in terms of one of the things we think about is like, oh, Asian Americans are apolitical. You're not supposed to be organizing. You're not supposed to be speaking truth to power. But
mm,
ethnic studies talk so heavily about that. That's what they did, right? In order for us to have in the late 1960s was when the Third World Liberation strike happened in San Francisco State
mm,
University. And that was the longest student strike in US history. And because of this coalition of Black Student Union, Third World Liberation Front, which was composed of Asian Americans, Latina,
mm,
Native Americans, and white allies, we wouldn't have African American studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies, right? Chicano studies today.
mm.
So I think exposing our youth to that information is really important because it shows them that they don't have to adhere to this neat, obedient Asian American.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think also allowing our youth to be exposed to different ways of really navigating the world, right? I think exposing them to art, to culture, right? To be able to
mm.
see themselves as artists, as dancers. Um,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think a lot about Jokoy, this Filipino comedian, and he talks about this in one of his comedy shows of this Filipino nurse who was, so desperate to be a dancer, but he wasn't able to become a dancer because he had to be a nurse because it's a Filipino stereotype. So he's like dancing in his scrubs in the hospital because that's as far as he could go, right? But then it's funny, but it also like makes you think about,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
what if your Filipino
yeah,
parents actually let you become a dancer? Right. And
mm,
I think,
yeah,
and we wouldn't know, right, unless we
yeah.
expose youth to other careers and professions beyond what we expect them to pursue.
That's so true. We don't. We have a very defined sort of course of thinking around what the pathway our youth are supposed to follow. I'm curious to know because I have a sense of like active like resistance,
Mhm.
and I'm curious to know from you what are some small ways that we can practice resistance maybe in our daily lives. As sort of just this active, like, I refuse to walk this one-dimensional caricature that has been forced upon me.
Yeah. I think one of the things that really comes up to me first is really understanding what your values and morals are,
Mm,
right? I think because having a clear understanding of that and knowing what lines you're not willing to cross
oh,
is really important
yeah.
because I think that's a form of resistance. If you truly believe in social justice and equity and liberation for all,
Yes.
then I think there are pressures that come into your work in your daily life where you feel like you have to make a choice, right?
Mm,
But I think having that very clear and crystal clear for you will really help you make the decisions that
yes.
you need to do,
Yes.
right? I also truly believe in building relationships with one another. I
Mm,
think I used to be a community organizer before I came into academia.
okay.
It's something that I'd like to come back to. But right now, I think being on the tenure track, it's very busy.
You are
But
incredibly busy, yes.
so it's one thing that really showed me with community organizing is that you can't organize until you build in like deep and trustworthy relationships with people because that's how you're able to really move the needle together, right? And
Mm,
really change oppressive structures and really raise and address concerns that are affecting many of us.
yeah,
So I think those are like some of the ways. And again, continue to educate ourselves. So
yes.
that's one of the reasons why we created the Asian American Critical Consciousness
Mm,
Project, because we wanted to be a public resource for everyone, not just for Asian Americans. Because in this time, so much information like about ethnic studies and gender studies and
yeah,
women's studies are really being erased, right? Or being taken physically off the bookshelves of libraries,
yeah.
right? So I think having this public resource is really important because what really led to that project was that there was a study that was done by Dr. Michael Krauss, who's a psychologist at Northwestern University. And it's this idea of short informational videos. So they found that when they had Asian Americans watch this short 2-minute video on Japanese incarceration during World War II, they were more likely to support reparations for descendants or of Black African Americans who were enslaved,
Oh,
right?
wow.
So again, these like little shifts are
Yes.
really helpful in helping shift our mindset
Yeah.
about policies, about ideologies, right? So I think
That's
having
powerful.
yes,
That
yeah.
is powerful data because, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you,
Oh
but
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that you're not at all suggesting that we, you know, go on this like 2-year meditation and reconstruct and rebuild ourselves. You just
Yeah.
said to watch a video, and that
Mhm.
actually created that's a significant shift, at least in my humble eyes. That's significant.
Yes. And I think our youth are already doing it. I mean, it
Yeah.
happened so much, especially during COVID in
Mm.
2020.
Yes.
There were all these like creators in like TikTok and Instagram who started talking about the model minority myth. I was like, wow, when I was growing up, people were not talking about that. And to
No.
see it like as I'm scrolling through Instagram or TikTok,
Mm.
right? And we saw so many of our Asian American youth come out on the streets, right?
Yes.
And really talk about Asian hate and Asian racism that
Yes.
was increasing in terms of I mean, racism has always existed in
Yes.
our communities, right?
Yes.
But to actually like, be able to name it and actually understand that there's an increase in reports of this.
Yes.
So it was really a powerful, I think, tool. So being able
Absolutely.
to consolidate and have these resources available is really important.
Absolutely. I love that. What you're sharing with us right now feels very actionable. Like I can go on and I can watch a 2-minute video right after this and I can reflect on what my values are. I want to
Mhm.
ask you a follow-up question to the relationship building piece. I hear from you that it's very also important not only to build relationships within our own groups, but it also is important to reach out to other groups as well and to build those relationships and to develop that collaboration and that understanding And I'm wondering if you have any advice for the Asian American person who might be reluctant or who might be operating from a place of a stereotype projecting onto a particular group. What must happen within that individual in order to just start a conversation with someone who might not look like them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And
Yeah.
I think just taking one step back on this,
Yes.
there's been studies on contact theory, right? So,
Mm.
contact theory is this idea that if we're exposed to people outside of our identities, then
Yes.
we're more likely to have a better understanding of them, be supportive of their own struggles. As a professor, right, I teach diversity, racism, oppression, and privilege. And I
Mm.
think sometimes I hear from our students of color specifically that, oh, like it's not my job to teach you
Mm.
about racism and about my people and
Mm.
whatnot, right? So I think to your question, going back to that, is one, a lot of these resources, like the Asian American Critical Consciousness Project and books, are available to
True.
learn about
Yes.
histories of people, racism, learning about systems of oppression. So I
Mm.
think one, doing our own self study, and
Mm.
then two, it's just about really just chatting it up with people, maybe in your workplace
Yeah.
or in your neighborhood or your local grocery market, right? Like really being able to cultivate these deep relationships with people, right? Your
Mm.
coworkers who um, may not be Asian American, right? Like maybe inviting them for coffee or lunch, right?
Mm.
Because I think, especially in any workplace, right? It's political, right? So I think
Oh,
finding community and allies in your workplace, like that's a form of organizing, right?
yes.
Especially if y'all want to change like organizational policies, right?
Yeah.
Or let's say something's happening in your neighborhood and you've developed these like relationships with your neighbors, right? Maybe you like you made extra cookies and you dropped them off there, and through that you're able to like start having more regular meetups with your neighbors. And let's say something's happening in your neighborhood and you can all organize together because you've already built that trust and that relationship with people. So I think in summary, one, self-education is
Mm.
important.
Yeah.
And then two is genuine, authentic, intentional relationships
Oh,
with
I love
people.
that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for going there with me. For someone who has spent decades performing a version of themselves by way of perhaps the stereotype of the model minority, how do they begin? What are those first steps that they can take to begin unlearning that and finding their way back to their authentic selves?
For me, one is really understanding your values, your morals, your boundaries,
Yeah.
right? And then at the same time, learning about our own history. Critical consciousness scholars have created these three constructs that make up critical consciousness, which is once you've learned about systems of oppression, once you've learned about histories of resistance and
Mm.
organizing and movements, it really, and you're able to tie that to your own lived experiences. That's critical reflection.
Wow.
And from critical reflection, we move towards critical motivation, which now really gives us the push to be like, oh, I feel like I could actually do something. And I feel motivated to actually address an issue that's
Mm.
affecting me and my community. And
Yes.
then that leads towards critical action when you
Yeah.
actually do engage in that. Right. And I also really also truly believe in the power of storytelling. There's power as well in also being able to learn about our own family's histories. So even just sitting down with your grandparents and like taking a voice note recorder and just asking them, can you tell us about our family?
Mm.
Right? Because sometimes they'll just like tell you random stories and you're like, what? I didn't know that. Why didn't you tell me this? Right.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, I was randomly talking to my mom and she's like, oh, yeah, like your great grandfather, he was part of the Katipuneros, which is like these Filipino revolutionaries who fought against Spanish, in Japanese and American occupation, right? Because the Philippines was under Spanish occupation for over 300 years and
Mm.
then under American occupation, right? From 1902 to 1946, then the Japanese came. So I was like, you didn't tell me we had a family member who was like, oh, who was part of the revolutionary. She's like, yeah,
Yeah.
they're like, when he died, a bunch of like Katipuneros came and like laid the Katipunan flag on his casket.
Oh,
I was
wow.
like,
Wow.
wow. I was like, that's powerful because
Yeah.
that's part of your own identity development, right?
Absolutely.
And we know in research is that identity development, having a strong understanding of your ethnic, your gender, your sexual orientation development is actually a protective factor from experiences of discrimination and racism.
Okay. Okay.
Because like when people discriminate against you,
Yeah.
you're like, I'm not bothered by what you have to say because I know who I am. I know who my people are. I know my culture and I'm proud of it. So whatever you say about me, about my race, my ethnicity, it doesn't bother
It doesn't bother you. Oh,
me.
love
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. May I ask, how do you begin to experience joy and pride, even pride in your authentic identity?
Yes. I think with this question, really think about consuming um, I think media, literature, information that makes me happy, that makes
Mm,
me proud of who I am. So I think
mm,
about your podcast that
yeah.
really centers Asian American experiences.
Mm,
I think about movies and literature. And being a professor myself, I read a lot on Asian American research.
yes.
But these are things that fill my cup, right? I
Mm,
think that that gives me a lot of pride and that gives me a lot of joy because it
yeah.
tells such a broader story of our people and our own lived experiences. And it also, especially with more recent research, it continues to evolve what the Asian American identity is about. It's not this, while we have this wonderful history that we read, right? I mean, there's all these like binaries of Asian American identity, like
Mm,
among Asian American women, right? The dragon lady versus the
yeah.
lotus blossom,
Yeah.
right? Among Asian American men are asexual,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
kind of these like portrayals. But I think when we look at Asian Americans today, it's beyond those images, right? So I think I think one is being able to consume these things that help with your identity development, your identity pride, your joy. Being able to join, I think for me, organizations, attending community events,
Mm,
that is, really important to me. I think that helps me. That also gives me joy. And then also being able to create things and resources and tools as an academic myself for other people to be able to access and consume to help with their own identity development is really important. So, beyond the Asian American Critical Consciousness Project, we also recently got a grant to develop a chatbot for Asian American LGBTQ adults. And it's similar to the Critical Consciousness Project, where we're basically using all of these publicly accessible data on Asian Americans and feeding it into the chatbot. And we're going to have Asian American LGBTQ young adults interact with the chatbot
oh my gosh.
for 2 weeks, right? For 10 to 15 minutes a day, where they get to learn about different things about Asian American and LGBTQ identity, right? Like someone can log in and be like, tell me about the Muslim minority. And then the chatbot will tell them. And then, part of critical consciousness is critical reflection. So we're
Mm,
also designing prompts to be like, how does this relate to your own lived experiences? So then they're also able to not just consume, but also critically reflect
thank
about what they just learned.
Wow. Congratulations on that. That sounds incredible.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's a public resource as well. So we're excited for that.
I would love to hear from you. From a research perspective, what happens when someone begins to develop a critical consciousness about who they are? And what kind of changes do you tend to see in how they show up or make decisions? You beautifully walked us through, the different stages of developing critical consciousness. Um, I'm curious to know, what kind of changes do you tend to see when they start to really develop this? Like what will that person experience and how will they think differently?
Yes. Yeah. So right now I'm working on a scoping review as well as a meta-analysis on the effects of critical consciousness. So what we've seen is that when people increase their critical consciousness, one, of course, there's this more understanding of critical thinking
Mm,
and critical reflection, better understanding of systems of repression, and being able to understand that our own lived experiences, especially in social work, a lot of our communities and clients that we work with often self-blame themselves and be like,
uh,
this is my fault. Um, this is the condition that I'm living in. But
mm,
actually if you expose your clients or the communities you work with to critical reflection, they're able to actually understand that, oh, it's not an individual problem. It's
mm,
actually a system of oppression that I constantly have to swim in, right? That these are institutions you constantly have to interact and
yeah,
navigate that is systematically oppressing you, right?
yeah,
And this is why you're dealing with depression and mental health, right?
mm,
Issues, right? So we see that on that one end. And then in terms of health behaviors and outcomes, we do see in our work, people are less likely to use substances. They're
Mm.
also less likely to engage in risky sexual health behaviors.
Mm.
And we've also seen an improvement in mental health outcomes. And if you, also another like study to also kind of look into San Francisco Unified School District, it's actually now a requirement for their high school student to take one ethnic studies course in order to graduate high school. And
Oh,
yeah, which is wonderful. And I know some unified school districts in California have also done the
yeah,
same.
yeah.
So there was a study done at Stanford University in the School of Education, and they were actually able to follow high school students that took their ethnic studies course. And they were also able to find that by the end of taking their ethnic studies class, they were less likely to skip class. And then their grades also increased. So again, there's this kind of sense of, oh, I'm learning about my people, or
Mm.
even like people that may not look like me, but it's something I've never been exposed to in like US history and whatnot, and learning about systems of oppression. So students become more engaged and there's more of a buy-in to really learn,
Wow.
right? So there's this whole benefit of critical consciousness. I mean,
Yes.
also to say that as a researcher, I also have to say that there are also some, I think, mixed outcomes that we've seen with critical consciousness,
Okay.
particularly with critical motivation and critical action, is that
Mm.
sometimes people feel so overwhelmed that they become helpless about addressing an issue,
Mm.
right? When we think about these big problems, right,
Yeah.
with issues of racism and sexism, and you become so overwhelmed at how big it is that sometimes then people become less motivated to
I see.
actually address something,
Yeah.
right? So it's all about doing, like what you said earlier, engaging in these little forms of resistance,
Mm.
because that helps chip away at these systems of
Okay.
oppression.
Yeah, I can see how that could be an outcome for sure. I imagine if you've spent a lifetime really blaming yourself and learning about all of these different systems of oppression that are interlinked, interlocked, and intentionally designed to harm, I can imagine that that can be an overwhelming feeling. Is there something that you just mentioned? So is there some you just mentioned that perhaps exposing yourself might be better to do it in small amounts.
Yeah.
Curious to know how might somebody who is feeling overwhelmed, who had just learned about this, what might they do? Do you have any recommendations for that person?
Yeah, I mean, there's power in one just like learning about it,
Yeah.
right? When you read the news about something that's happening and you're like, actually don't know a lot about that. Let me just educate myself.
Mm.
That's already like a form of critical action.
Uh,
Being able to share that with people in your network, like, repost it on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, because it also exposes people around you to at least like put it in their radar, whether they like learn about it.
I see.
Those are forms of like micro activism, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
hopefully then that might trigger something more for other people and be like, well, actually, this is like a really an important issue. Maybe I should like look into what my local organizations are doing about this. It
Okay.
might encourage volunteerism. It might encourage getting more involved with organizing. It might encourage people to run for local office, right? So I
Yeah.
think there's all these like little things that can eventually lead into bigger.
Okay, okay. That's helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that going out and learning or getting more involved perhaps in a community-based organization or even considering running for office, these are all there's baby steps that lead up to these larger
Yes.
actions and to give yourself grace in
Mhm.
doing that. It sounds like anytime you think and want to push back on a stereotype, a construct, it feels so empowering to know that just reading about it is an act of resistance.
Yeah, yeah. And
Before
there's a reason why we were denied of this information for so long,
oh,
right? Like I didn't learn about histories of Asian American resistance and
yeah,
organizing until I went to college because I was able to take a class on that. But I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, these are just snippets in our American history book. I'll never forget there was one paragraph in high school on the Philippine American War, and that was it.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
but you're like, well, actually, there's more into this. Yeah.
yes. Is there anything that you would want every Asian American to know about themselves?
That you come from a history of
Mm,
resistance and survival, and that people fought for us to be in these spaces and to exist, and that it's our duty
mm.
today to also do the same for the younger generation that's coming right after
Mm,
us.
yes, beautifully said. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that perhaps you would want to share with the Courage class community?
Continue to support Asian American work,
Mm,
whether that's purchasing books in your local bookstores, right? Or also really being able to also promote the work that you see that Asian Americans are doing, right? If you see an article that they did, if you see maybe there's an Asian American artist that's doing an exhibition or performing somewhere, I think it's important for us to support our communities and beyond that, also being in cross racial solidarity with other
mm,
communities of color. So, you know, if there are
absolutely.
wonderful Black, Native American,
Yes. Yeah.
Latin artists and scholars that are, you know, doing work or are going to be in your local area for a talk and whatnot, like I think it's important for us to also come and support that and promote.
Absolutely. And speaking of promotion, thank you for sharing that, by the way. Speaking of promotion, we talked about the Asian American Critical Consciousness Project. You were the principal investigator of this project. What other exciting opportunities? You mentioned the chatbot and everything. Can we just give it its own airtime? What can we excitedly expect and await to embrace and celebrate when it comes to your work?
So, well, now that you ask, we have. I'm about to launch my lab. It's called the Health Liberation Lab, and our whole goal is to basically one identify protective factors from
Okay.
experiences of racism
Mm,
and other forms of repression on health outcomes, and then two, create these tools that we can use in interventions, right? That people can use, right, in their classrooms or in their practice or in their daily lives. So when we launch that website, I'll make sure to forward it to Doctor Who,
please.
and then you'll see all of the articles we've been publishing on this, and also all the resources and tools that we'll develop that you can use.
And are you, it sounds like you're working with the team. Are you working with a team of researchers at NYU or are you spread about across the country?
Yeah, so right now we're starting small, so primarily the graduate students that I work with, that I mentor, and then of course some collaborators that are here at NYU and also in the local universities, like Dr. Raj Korping, who's at Hunter College. He's in the Department of Computer Science, so he's the one that's helping us build the chatbot. So yeah,
Wow. Cool. That is amazing. Okay, so we'll await that exciting announcement and we will be sure to post it on our website as well. Um, would you be willing just to go through some rapid
yeah.
reflection? What's one book that changed your life?
More recently, Unassimilable by Bianca Mabuta-Lui.
Mm,
Uh, I think a seminal book, another seminal book, is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde.
okay. Thank you for sharing that. What does courage mean to you?
Authenticity.
Authenticity. Yeah. In everything. Yes. And what do you courageously aspire for in your professional life and in your personal life?
Provide the data and resources that we need to liberate ourselves.
Mm, that's beautiful. And you have indeed liberated all of us by sharing so much incredible information. I am so grateful to you for sharing the research, the data, your insight, your expertise, the recommendations from your own personal life. I mean, you just really allowed us to go everywhere with you today. And for that, I am so grateful. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you for creating this wonderful resource for the Asian American community.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Courage Class. I hope today's conversation gave you a little encouragement and inspiration. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And for extra motivation, tools, and behind the scenes content, sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to share with you more there. See you next time. All right, and now for the legal language. Courage Class with Dr. Lindsay Kwok Hugh and content posted by Dr. Lindsay Kwok Hugh is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast or website is at the user's own risk. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not regard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical or mental health condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professional for any such conditions.